Mythmaking, and here's a beginning tour of my website and some of the ideas that have inspired me within my writing. And you'll see that starting with the idea of the dawn of Western thought, and according to legend, a little over 2,500 years ago, Pythagoras of Samos set up one of the first schools in the West. And this institution was dedicated to natural philosophy, which explored wisdom in all of its forms. This natural philosophy integrated both science and spirituality while remaining firmly rooted in reality. And as we'll find out through my writings, some of the ideas on this website, some of these ideas even laid the foundation for modern science and religion. And for me, as a storyteller and teacher, I found this tidbit of history completely enthralling and still do. And this idea of science and spirituality being blended in a practical manner has really been a source of inspiration for my first book, which is Science and Perception, as well as the upcoming book called The Spring of the Leaf. So that's kind of the foundation, this idea of way back, 2,500 years ago, when science was first being explored in the West, that science and spirituality were actually integrated with each other. Were actually looked at as kind of one and the same. And this is a time before the split between modern science and religion. So, Pythagorean system of philosophy, which was later adopted by the later Platonists and then the Neoplatonists, actually integrated science and spirituality through geometry and mathematics. So when people ask about, well, what's the purpose of math? If you go back far enough, it was actually viewed as part of a spiritual discipline. And we have evidence for this in Plutarch, where he credits Plato with saying that God geometrizes and geometrizes continually. So you're starting to get this idea of a world of creation, a world created by higher power or by consciousness that's in a continuous state of creation, not something that was created and kind of left alone or deserted, which was one of the ideas of the later mechanists within the Western world. And Plato himself actually ties mathematics directly to spirituality in the Republic. From Plato's perspective, mathematics provided people with a practical way to understand abstract concepts, which would allow for deeper insights into the spiritual realm. So for me, this is kind of funny because you hear people all the time saying, well, what's the purpose of math? And they're like, well, you have to learn it so you can teach your kids or something like that. And back then, if you were privileged enough to learn math, which took a long time, it was viewed as a gateway to spirituality, a way to understand and work with abstract concepts, even concepts such as God. And we'll come to that in the next one. You have this idea that God geometrizes continually, and shows for me just how intertwined science and spirituality were with each other. Rather than starting from nothing, like our modern view, the Platonic view of reality actually starts with an initial state of unity, or something you can view as an all-encompassing everything. And this idea of everything, all-encompassing unity, actually had heavy influence on modern concepts of God, particularly within, say, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity through the Neoplatonist Plotinus. Under this model, one way to interpret it at least, is that numbers arise from a geometric process of division. And this idea is fascinating to me because if you start with unity, and unity being everything, like absolute unity, then there's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take away from it. There's nowhere to move outside of it. It's everything. So the only way that you can actually end up with this differentiated world that we see, or a differentiated world, would be to divide it up within itself, kind of like the way a cell does through mitosis. So it's actually subdividing. And that's the idea, is that this all-encompassing unity subdivides within itself. And the analogy would be a geometric progression. And this would be how creation came about from a Platonic view, and even possibly a Pythagorean view. And the Pythagoreans are famous for claiming that all is number. So by beginning with absolute unity, Pythagoreans posited a model where everything is created through division, thereby making the world equivalent to mathematical entity. So if you start with unity, then anytime you divide it, you're coming up with numbers. You're dividing and multiplying simultaneously. And this would make all concepts inherently relative to one another. And it provides a potential explanation for the world of opposites we appear to inhabit, or that we live in, good and bad, or good and evil, tall and short, everything. It's because we're categorizing. We're actually participating in this creative process, and everything does, because it's all part of unity. And instead of being conflicting opposites, there are ways of comparing, contrasting, of splitting and dividing, so that it can be understood or conceptualized, meaning the world and objects, or what we refer to as objects within the world. And the Pythagorean claim that all is number really makes sense if we go out on a limb and we start modeling experiential reality not only as an interwoven web, but a web of ideas more than objects. And these ideas, categories, are what gives rise to the various forms that appear to inhabit our world. And this gives rise to an older statement made by some Hermetic philosophers that borrowed from the Pythagoreans, that all is mind. And the notion is that the world is populated with ideas, if it's populated with ideas. Now that's a Platonic concept, straight out of Republic and some of other Plato's concepts. But I find it really intriguing because even an object, or what we call an object, a physical object, is really just another classification or set of ideas. It's a way to classify ideas. It's a way to group them together. And when we're grouping, we're really speaking in terms of number as well. So one way to interpret this would be that the universe is more mental than physical in its essential nature, because we're really working with concepts. Objects are a small subset of these concepts, or what we call physical objects, but they're still mental or mathematical concepts, concepts that give rise to form or allow us to understand form. And this is one possible way to give credence to the idea that all is mind. And this idea of a mental universe I find incredibly intriguing. It really laid the groundwork for Science and Perception, which is my first book, which published almost 2 years ago now. And it provides incredible depth of structure for book 2, and both fiction and nonfiction. So as far as I can tell, what's most interesting is that this model appears to be logically consistent. And it even opens up the possibility that the universe might be alive. It's this idea of a living universe, living in the sense of consciousness. So everything, all objects, because they're enclosed are actually a part of this overarching unity, which would be unity of consciousness, or a field of, the closest thing would be to say a field of consciousness, but even the idea of a field would be out, is it's just absolute unity, pure intelligence, and everything's an expression of that intelligence. And if that sounds a little bit more like religion than science, then you have an idea of how science and spirituality could have been blended together under this model and eventually split into those apparently compared, contrasting factions that we see today, but they really could actually be two separate sides of the same coin. And that gives you kind of a brief outline of everything, or not everything, but the basic model that I work with throughout the website, what I research, what I like to write about, and just this unusual idea of a mental universe, or a universe, a living universe that is kind of an all-encompassing field of intelligence.